So, so her mom, Tashi, I'm sorry, remind me of her full name.
Oh, Natasha Rumani, and then her
Natasha.
family just calls her Tashi.
Right. So, she's somebody who's had a lot of trauma in her life. She lost her father at a young age. She was maybe what, 12 or 13,
hmm Early
right?
adolescence.
And I mean, I don't know, would you say, I mean, is she diagnosed as schizophrenic? Is it not that serious? I mean, she definitely has, I mean, she's had suicidal ideation. She's many times tried to die by suicide. And she's also, if not brilliant, very smart, does really good work. But, the idea is like, was this a pathological thing? Was this like a way of like dealing with her trauma? But she's known to be like not very neat, right? Doesn't keep a neat house, et cetera, et cetera. And I know there's a lot there about, kind of the unfair ideas we have about women and expectations of women. But I'd love to know a little bit about the character of Tashi and just kind of that pull between her traumas and her job and wanting to be a good mother and all of that.
Yeah, thanks for asking about Tashi. Not everybody does, and she was a really early and interesting character that
Mhm.
was also sort of tough to figure out. Um, so sure, she has a pretty fat medical record, and there are diagnoses in it. But like Betty, she has her own life and her own existence, and there have been times at periods of crisis where medical professionals try to apply some labels.
Uh-huh.
She hears her dead father's voice whenever she's trying to measure up to the standards that her
Mm.
profession and her family set for her. Um, she alleviates that by obeying his instructions. Like for instance, when she was doing really well at work after, she'd given birth to Betty, but Betty was with Nuha, and Tashi returned to Portland where she was an adjunct professor in neuroscience. And she's kind of getting her ducks back in a row, but she's, sleeping in, I think, what her mother called the like halfway house for underfunded scientists on a
Yeah,
futon on the floor.
that was a great turn of phrase. You must have kind of laughed at yourself or pat yourself on the back for that one.
I have a lot of underpaid academic friends.
Um,
Um, but so she's hearing her father's voice, and he's telling her to find suicide and bury it. So sometimes it's these like toenail clippings or a pillowcase, and she takes it down to the park that backs up to the apartment building where she lives, and she's like burying these items in the dirt to sort of alleviate the stress. So
right.
she has these strange behaviors. She's definitely gone through periods of diagnosable depression. I mean, she spent time institutionalized.
Hmm.
Um, there's been, long years of her life where she's been completely okay. And it's not, when I was writing these characters, it was not a surprise to discover that she's the one character that doesn't try to explain why Betty is blue. Um,
Hmm.
that blue as a color doesn't have the cultural context in America that it does in some other parts of the world.
Hmm.
Um, and as I wrote draft upon draft of this novel, I realized that not quite explaining what the blue means was actually a better opportunity than trying to explain what it does mean, because so many of the other characters are trying to tell Betty what that's about. And Tashi has experienced that too. So, she's not a classically maternal person,
Right.
but she's a really good mother for Betty.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and her family struggles to see her in that way, but she's also shouldering a lot of guilt too, because sort of the way it all works out is, the Romani family has had this soap factory in Nablus for centuries, and after the Nakba in 1948, foundation of the State of Israel, the economy in Palestine changed quite a bit. So the family's soap fortunes struggled for many decades, and finally, with the family's fortunes going the way that they did, Tashi's mother decided to sell off the factory. So sell off the sort of last connection that the family had to this land,
Right.
and use that money to put her kids through college. So
Mhm.
Tashi is a beneficiary of sort of hundreds of years of
Yeah.
lineage and family reputation. And her family is always reminding her in some way of how she's not living up to that.
Mm,
So she's got a pretty big burden to carry.
she
Uh,
does. Yeah, definitely. There's so there's so Nuha is kind of introduced through so Tachi does not end up giving Betsy up for adoption. Nuha kind of comes into the story there. She's quite a rebel in many ways. Her sister is Saida, is that how you pronounce that? I'm sorry, her
Her sister-in-law Saida,
sister-in-law,
yeah.
pardon me, yes.
Mhm,
And so she's the grandmother, right? She's Tashi's mom. So we get to
mhm,
know them through, through the birth. And there was a lot of kind of intrigue around that, around the birth and the adoption and stuff. Like you said, kind of disappointment in Tashi and just those burdens on her. The coincidence, which the narrator writes, is kind of like there are no coincidences in life, kind of thing, or coincidence is always around. Is that
mhm,
the day of the birth, the F-16s of the Israeli army, I would assume, they come
mhm,
through Nablus and they obliterate the 600-year soap factory, like you talk
mhm.
about. And in the families, in the Romani families, like, okay, was it because the girl was born that the soap factory was done for? Was it vice versa? Just trying to assign meaning to it. Um, I wonder about the timing, the coincidence, and how you drew those two together.
Sure. I mean, this was written, like I said, I started writing it in a handful of years after 9/11, but the novel itself takes place starting the Battle of Nablus historical event, April 2nd, 2002.
Mm.
So that was a really eventful time. There was, post 9/11, the US had invaded Afghanistan. We were, trying to create this bogus argument to invade Iraq.
Mm.
But also, the Second Intifada, the uprising had started in Israel and Palestine. And it was a much more violent conflict than the First Intifada in the 80s had been. So it was sort of this kind of younger generation, trying to stand up to a lot of the sort of militant oppression and occupation and, the difficulties of daily life in the West Bank and Gaza. And uh, as part of that, Nablus has historically been a center of Palestinian resistance and identity. So it was high up on the target list whenever Israel strikes back.
Mhm.
So, as I write at the end of, I think, chapter one, that coincidence just sometimes plays a role. And
Yeah.
and Nuha Rumani kind of she played this role in the family as the matriarch, sort of creating a certain amount of agency and power for herself, being a storyteller and
Hmm.
taking up a lot of space with the stories that she tells. And a lot of that is sort of keys off of the Romani family history. Um, so she's 79 years old at the start of the story. She's definitely pretty old to be taking care of a baby. But whenever she finds out that Tashi's planning to give Betty up for adoption, and she sees that Betty is cobalt blue, she steps in and she says that she's going to make herself useful one more time and help
Right.
raise this baby, because I mean her job has traditionally been to make meaning. And I mean, as you mentioned earlier, the beginning of the story, Betty is stillborn, but when
Hmm.
she does come back to life, she turns this cobalt blue. And the family, her parents had recently divorced because of an infidelity. There's this sort of larger family feud around Saida having sold the soap factory,
Hmm.
15 or 20 years before then. Um, the, a lot of the storytelling is interested in this idea of aftermath and what next.
Sure.
When things are broken, as so many things in our world are,
Mm.
we can sit around and point out where the cracks are, or we can use that observation to try to fix them and to try to make a meaning that we can move into. So I mean, Nuha steps into that role in Betty's life as well. But the coincidence of having the soap factory destroyed, that just helped her in her
Okay.
task.
Okay. No, I mean, you talk about those two ways of dealing with those things, and the first one's a lot more fun though, right? Just kind of sit back and point fingers and not to do anything about it. It's a lot easier.
It is a lot easier. I engage in some of that myself. I'm
Right?
not immune.
Doesn't necessarily help things, but it's
No, it
a little
doesn't.
easier. Well, so like you talk about Nuha steps into this role as kind of a grandmotherly and aunt. I mean, she's literally an auntie, figure.
Mhm.
So you talk about trying to assign meaning and trying to figure out things in life, and a lot of times I mean, cultures all throughout history, right? We've come up with stories and ways of explaining God and natural disasters. And so Nuha tells stories about gazelles and ogres and how do you pronounce the word? Is it Djinn?
Jinn.
Jinn.
It
D is
sounds
silent.
a lot like our genie. I mean,
Okay. Okay, right. And Babel and a lot of allegory, a lot of stories that she even admits herself, and even some that are more closer to real life, but they're not necessarily the 100% the truth, right?
mhm. She's an exaggerator. The whole
She's
family
an
knows it. And
exaggerator. Yes. Yes. So we have the parallel stories, Betty, and there so it was Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, yeah, it's the sort of Arabic version of Elizabeth.
That's what I figured. Okay, yeah. And about her being like the original in the family who had the blue skin color, right? And Nuha tells about these stories, and Betty gets to know these stories. And in many ways, Betty tells her stories with a I'm sorry, not Betty, Nuha with a moral, right? Like in some ways, some of the stories are like to hell with what people think, right?
Hmm.
She very
Yeah,
much is her own person.
they're more sort of radical morals, or have your own checkbook if you're a woman.
Yes.
Sort of the lessons that she has learned as a queer divorcee, trying to live a life that's completely separate from the family while still being the family matriarch.
Right.
She's imparting them to Betty in her storytelling.
Yeah, and so through these notebooks that Betty unearths, years later after Nuha has passed away. And so those parallel stories, we talked about already how Betty is, what do I do? Do I leave my mom? Do I go to, this other country with my lover, with my girlfriend, wife?
Beloved.
Beloved. There you go. Beloved.
Hmm.
Okay. And it's also very sad because Nuha was her own person. She was very upfront. I mean, she had some great one-liners like in the interrogations and all the time. She had some great sarcastic remarks. But because of homophobia, because of maybe, I don't know how much of that was internalized because of the
A lot.
external, right?
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
The time she grew up in, the whatever, but she wrote about it in her notebooks. Tell us about about her affair, like I don't mean affair like in the way we think of it
Hmm.
romantically, but her affair, her times with C, who she calls C,
Hmm.
and kind of how what that fleshes out about her as a character.
Sure, and you're right on. Nuha does have a huge amount of internalized homophobia. I mean, sort of her cultural background and her generation, and certainly um, putting at risk the authority that she does have in the family, because certainly
Hmm.
not everybody would be supportive. Even being divorced uh, was sort of a mark against her in
Uh-huh.
a lot of parts of the family. But after she is divorced, I mean, it's sort of a marriage of convenience. I won't give anything away.
Yeah,
Um,
we're gonna stay away from the plot spoilers. Yeah.
yeah, we'll skip the spoilers. So she goes to the teachers college at Mills College in Oakland, and she gets her teaching degree in history. She's a school teacher, and she kind of sets up her own life. I mean, she's an
Hmm.
activist. She meets a woman that really loves her, and wants her to be out, and wants to start a committed life with her. But Nuha is just unable and unwilling to do that, and to live her life as an out woman.
Hmm.
So C kind of moves on, but they're still in the same city, and they are still very much in each other's lives now and again. Tashi lived with Nuha for a period of her own teenage years,
Hmm.
and was sort of aware of this relationship, but it
Right.
it was just something that wasn't spoken about.
Sure. Sure.
And Betty's growing up in a completely different generation, and can see it for what it is,
Hmm.
um, and and obviously feels the resonance with her own situation, that you have a life that you know and love, and what are you willing to sacrifice
Mm.
in order to be with someone that loves you, and you care about, and that you both like and need, is sort of one of the novel's definitions of love.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, we'll kind of stay away from the plot spoilers, kind of like the
Mhm.
last two plot points I kind of talk about that, that leave us maybe 80 pages out or something. But, so Betty, by I guess she's 7 or 8, 7, she finally does go to school. There's this idea of what do we do? her parents, Adam and Tashi, are like, how much do we take her out in public? And there's the whole scene at the airport, and where Tashi decides not to do the flight at first, and I think ends up doing it. And do we drive her? How much should she be out in public? And she, unfortunately, when she does go to school, she really is made fun of and and treated horribly in her class until man, Felix got his, huh? Felix got his comeuppance, huh? Woof, man.
Like so many screenwriters that write
It felt
heartfelt
good.
and heartwarming stories about teenage characters. I
Uh,
did get to get back at the bully in my
yeah, you
story.
did. Yeah, you did. Sorry, Felix. But so they do this pen pal program, and she gets to know Anna through the writing at first. It's anonymous, and then it's not anonymous. So there is that lifeline to the quote unquote the real world, the outside world, which is such a nice ray of sunshine. Um, so Saida and Nuha, the sisters-in-law, they decide 2011, I think it ends up becoming, or so, to go to Palestine, to go back. Um,
Hmm.
Kelly, who was the second husband of Saida, had passed away.
Hmm.
And it was just like, now's the time. We're getting older, and there's a lot that goes on there. We talk about the interrogation, just hard for them to even get into Palestine, with all the checkpoints and such. Um, so that really, that sets up some really important revelations and really, interesting denouement. I was looking for the word, right?
Hmm.
There's so many themes in the story that are so interesting and really make you think. We talked about, you know, I'm I'm oversimplifying, but just ideas of difference. I mean,
Hmm.
Betty's literally, the blue skinned person, just being yourself, the ideas of coming out. I was really, you talked a little bit about before, like post 9/11. It wasn't a huge part of the book. It was maybe a couple pages, but just like the assimilation that Saida did, like right after 9/11, put out certain floor mats and took in certain ones, and just how much about, how much do we tell the world, which again could be a small thing, how much do we tell the world about us being Palestinian, but just in general, how much do we tell the world about being queer, about, so many things. Um, is it is it oversimplifying? Is it reductive to say that you really do create some strong women?
I mean, these were the characters that bullied their way to the center of the story. So I would say that there's like
You
survival
got no
of
choice, right?
the strongest here.
Huh.
Um, but I was also really interested in Betty's father, Adam,
Hmm.
who starts out as an antagonist, and Tashi and Adam as Betty's parents are not on the same page. Where
Hmm.
Tashi is content to not assign meaning, sort of the one character who is content to not assign too much meaning to Betty. Whereas Adam, with his background in law and medicine, it's just a very intelligent, educated, sort of almost divorced from everything that isn't intellectual kind
Mm.
of character. That he really wants her to go to these doctor's appointments. He wants her to go to school, um, and some of that, really is, a lot of pragmatic knowledge about child development based on science and
Sure.
evidence-based medicine. But at the same time, um, you know, Tashi knows that common sense that Betty is really going to struggle there. And, you mentioned sort of a lot of dimensions of difference in talking about the novel. And I think
Mm.
that's really it when I'm like thinking about identity. It's not really one identity. It's sort of that idea of contrast or defining yourself against something else that I was,
Right.
discussing earlier. That we have all of these identities and roles inside of us that come to the fore depending on the situation that we're in. And
Hmm.
someone like Nuha, who, if you kind of stack up the isms that we could easily identify, that she faces over the course of the story of ageism and racism and
Mm.
homophobia and internalized homophobia and xenophobia, like that. There's just
Yeah.
a lot that each of these characters has to wade through, kind of, depending on the situation that they're in, and that they're all really trying to help Betty navigate that.
Right.
Um, So it's not reductive. I mean, it's a fact of life, and
Hmm.
I was interested in how these characters do it. And
Hmm.
I'm a cis woman. This is the body that I've been living my life in,
Hmm.
and I guess I'm sort of most familiar with the way of navigating the world in this body, and that sort of informed a lot of you know different angles of Nuha and
Yeah.
Tashi and Saida and Betty.
You have such a light touch, but such a skillful one with family strife and long memories. And we all have families where somebody insulted somebody's haircut one time 70 years ago, and it comes back to them and they're still upset about it, and that affects other generations, right? But
Yeah, like a fine wine, a grudge can age.
exactly. And just the idea of long memory. I mean, there's so much about Palestine and Israel where it's like, oh no, there was no Palestine before, or there was no Israel before. And just this idea of, a 600-year building, right? And just the generations and generations and generations, and the stories that are told, and the murder soap, people can read about that one. And the business agreement that the branches of the Romani family have been separate and come together, and what's come together, at least kind of ostensibly or on surface level. They're what basically is a business agreement, right? Just the idea of the pull of home, like how most people, I would probably include myself, who are fairly ignorant of the conflict, we think maybe back to 1947, right? But you make this point, about, I mean, just these are generations and generations, and for one family to have a 600-year soap company, right? And for that to go up in what, 20 minutes or whatever, or 2 minutes or 1 minute, is just really something to reflect on for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, contemporary history always feels very dense because we're wading through a volume of details, that we have the
Hmm.
archive to understand,
Right.
what happened on such and such a day of such and such a year. And since 1948, things have gotten progressively worse because
Hmm.
there is a wall, and the borders do get less and less permeable, and the
Hmm.
children don't play together. That there is a strand of this novel where I'm writing very much pre 1948, and for
Hmm.
instance, the village of Malul, which was a Muslim and Christian
Uh-huh.
village where Jewish settlers from, or not settlers, but Jewish residents of the next village would graze their flock on the neighboring hillside. That there
Hmm.
is a shared history of
Yes.
of cooperation that I think gets lost in the sort of overdetermination of identities, and
Hmm.
obviously with the deadly force that gets applied to this conflict. I mean, over and over, we've been seeing it, um, you know, heat up since last September or October, and it's very rarely reported on in our media now.
Hmm.
But it's distressing to see, and I hope, I don't lean so far into these issues that this book will be like like a foreign policy type
Sure.
of novel. I'm really interested in the Romani family
Hmm.
storytelling, and the humor of it, and the the long family feuds, and this
Hmm.
Palestinian soap, which I'm completely obsessed with. I mean, Nablus is a really cool city to walk around in,
Mm.
and I just I think you can read The Skin and Its Girl for the family story and for the characters and the humor. And if it provides just like one window or one touch point into
Hmm.
a part of the world that you might have not encountered before, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hackneyed, but it's just, I mean, you talk about, like, librarians and reading and empathy and being able to travel to different places, and though this is fiction, these are real people. To me, these are real people. And when
Mm-hmm.
you talk about, I'm sorry, how do you pronounce, is it how do you pronounce the village?
Malul.
And that's, some of the people said, oh, that's where Jesus jumped when he was a kid. It's not too far
Mount
from
Tabor.
Nazareth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, Mount Tabor, right.
And so, it just so much more makes it real, makes the people real. Like, like you talk about a lot of times, the maybe the stories are big in the news and then, just fade away, but there's still the daily lives. There's still, the woman working the desk at the with the glasses, at the interrogation. There's still, people coming back. I was so just, I guess we'll kind of end with like, does just the pull of home. Um, if I read it correctly, I mean, Nua, she's by the time she goes to Palestine, she's in her mid 80s,
Yeah, that's right.
right? And I
Hmm.
think she spent 7 years in Nablus, or maybe 7 years in, right?
Hmm.
Not a lot of time, in other words, but just like how it just speaks to home and wanting to go back, and often in this case maybe not finding it at all, or not finding it like it was. But that to me was just so interesting about how about her, somebody who was so engaged in, like you said, activism, and lived in the Bay Area, and knew English, and lived in States for so long, but home is always home.
Yeah, I mean, home is very tricky. I mean, it obsesses me too as someone. I mean, I've moved so many times. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think since I met my wife, we've moved something like 9 times in
Dang.
14 years. And
Wow.
we have the plastic tubs in the garage permanently loaded, ready for the next place.
Yes.
But I mean, how do we construct home? I mean, I'm interested in that question as a queer person. I mean, what relationships are central? Like, who are we with when we feel like we're at home?
Hmm.
And I think that that's such a human question. And I mean, it's a site of conflict whenever multiple groups say, no, this is my home, no, this is my home. Well,
Hmm.
the novel is like really critiquing systems,
Hmm.
more than any sort of one identity, because I think we do share that pull to home, and I think that is real. And that this also the desire to make meaning and tell stories. I mean, I think that's like a species defining behavior for
Hmm.
for humans. And where do we build that fire, and where do we sit in that circle and share those stories,
Hmm.
and who is in that circle? um, I think it is possible to have many homes. I mean,
Hmm.
almost unavoidable. I mean, I think of writers like Alice Munro, who beautiful fiction about one part of the planet
Sure.
where she's lived, and that you can just draw from this very deep well, from one spot on the planet. But I think that
That's
you
the
know
exception, not the rule, I think, right?
I think
Yeah.
for a lot of people it is. I mean,
Sure.
not everywhere, but
Yeah.
certainly in our country, like, people move around a lot.
Hmm. Well, I'm already thinking of one coworker that I'm going to give this book to.
Thank you.
And it's a book that I'm definitely going to be, I can never say the word, evangelizing about, in public life, as well as the public life as far as the podcast, and private as well. Such an interesting read. We left out some of the interesting plot points and some of the kind of twists, on identity and such. But just, congratulations. It's awesome talking to you. I'm really looking forward to seeing out in the world, and maybe talk to you when the next project comes around. But I just appreciate you talking to me, and thanks for writing this incredible book. And I know it's going to be crazy in the next week, month, but hopefully it's a fun crazy.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I mean, I think this podcast is just a beautiful act of literary citizenship, and it's really an honor to talk to you,
Oh,
uh, about my book, my
uh,
debut novel.
yes.
It
The fir-
doesn't get old.
there you go. Well, I appreciate those compliments. And again, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and have a great rest of the evening.
And thank you, Peter. You too.
Thank you.